She arrived with nothing but a worn leather bag and a name no one in Black Hollow could pronounce. He was a sheriff who hadn't spoken more than 20 words in a single day for 3 years running. The town said it would never work. The town said she'd be gone before the first thaw. But neither of them had any idea that the most dangerous thing waiting in that frozen winter town wasn't the outlaws, the cold, or the whispers. It was the slow, terrifying risk of letting someone in. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The train was 40 minutes late, which meant Sheriff Cole Mercer had been standing on the platform in the dark for 40 minutes, watching his own breath dissolve into the frozen air, wondering, not for the first time, whether this was the worst idea he'd had in recent memory. It was a long list to compete against. The advertisement had been Ruth Calloway's doing, mostly. Ruth ran the general store and had a habit of inserting herself into other people's business with the cheerful certainty of someone who was almost always right, which made her extremely difficult to argue with. She'd walked into his office 3 weeks prior, set a handwritten notice on his desk, and told him he was going to place it in the territorial newspaper. "You need help," she'd said, with the same tone she used when explaining to children why they couldn't have candy before supper. "I'm fine," Cole had answered, without looking up from the report he was writing. "Cole, you ate beans out of a tin for dinner last night. I saw the can outside your back door." "That's not illegal." "No, but it's sad." She pushed the notice closer to him. "Place the ad. Someone will answer." He'd placed the ad. He had told himself it was only to get Ruth off his back, but 3 weeks later he was standing on a platform in the dark, in the cold, in a town where the wind came down from the mountains with a kind of personal malice, waiting for whoever had answered. Only one person had. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, written in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal in the way of someone who had learned English, not as a child absorbing it from the air around them, but as an adult working through it with deliberate effort. The name signed at the bottom was Anya Novak. She had listed her experience, cooking, cleaning, household management, basic repair work, and written one sentence at the end that Cole had read twice without meaning to. "I am a hard worker, and I do not complain, and I'm looking for a place where I can be useful." He'd written back with the wage, the address, and the date to arrive. That had been the full extent of their correspondence. The train whistle came from somewhere in the dark, and Cole straightened up from where he'd been leaning against the platform post and buttoned the top button of his coat. The locomotive rolled in slowly, exhaling great clouds of steam into the November air, and the few people waiting beside Cole shuffled forward. The station master emerged from his little heated office looking inconvenienced, which was his default expression. The passengers came off in a small trickle. A cattleman Cole recognized from the east side of the valley. 2 young men who looked like brothers and were definitely drunk. A woman in a green coat who was met immediately by a man who grabbed her bags and started talking before she'd taken 3 steps off the train. And then, last off, carrying a leather bag that had seen better decades, a woman who stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at Black Hollow the way a person looks at something they've been told about but weren't sure they believed. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, Cole guessed. Dark hair pulled back practically under a hat that was warm rather than fashionable. Her coat was heavy wool, dark-colored, and had been mended at the left elbow with thread that didn't quite match. Her face was... He searched for the word and landed on composed. Not pretty in any soft or delicate way. Composed. Like someone who had decided a long time ago to hold themselves together regardless of circumstances, and had gotten very good at it. She came down the steps carefully. The wood was icy. And looked around the platform until her eyes found him. Or more accurately, found his badge, which was the part of him that was hardest to miss. She walked directly toward him, which he appreciated. No hesitation, no looking around for someone friendlier. "Sheriff Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "Miss Novak." He touched the brim of his hat. Up close, he could see she was tired. Not just tonight tired, but the kind of tired that had been accumulating for a long time. There were shadows under her eyes that sleep alone wouldn't fix. But her handshake, she extended her hand before he thought to offer his, was firm and dry and direct. "The train was delayed," she said. "They usually are this time of year. Snow on the tracks somewhere north." He picked up her bag before she could protest, mostly because it seemed heavy and he was already reaching for it. My wagon's out front. She followed him without comment. The ride from the station to his house took 12 minutes at a normal pace, but the road had iced over in the last 2 hours, and Cole kept the horse to a careful walk. Anya sat beside him on the wagon bench, her bag at her feet, looking at the town as they passed through it. Black Hollow was not, by most standards, an impressive sight, especially at night in November. The main street had a saloon, a general store, a church, a livery, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's office, and a collection of other storefronts that were mostly dark at this hour. The houses spread out behind the main street in clusters, smoke rising from their chimneys. "It is smaller than I expected," Anya said. "Most places are." She turned to look at him, and he got the impression she was deciding whether that was a satisfying answer or not. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "Originally, Bohemia." A pause. "It is in the Austrian Empire, Central Europe." Another pause, shorter. "People usually don't know." "I know where Bohemia is." She looked at him again, and something in her expression shifted slightly. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration of some kind. "How long have you been in the territory?" he asked. 4 years? I was in Chicago before, and before that, New York for 1 year when I first came." She said it the way someone recites a list of things that happened to them rather than things they chose. Cities as way stations, not destinations. Cole didn't ask anything else. The horse picked its way carefully around a patch of ice, and Anya put one hand out against the side of the wagon without thinking, steadying herself. She pulled it back when the danger passed. His house was at the north end of town, which meant it caught the wind first when it came down from the mountains, which it was doing now with considerable enthusiasm. It was a solid house, 2 stories, built from good timber, with a porch that wrapped around the front and part of the side. He had built it 6 years ago, when he had thought he was building it for more than just himself. The extra rooms had stayed empty since then. He pulled the wagon around to the side where the small barn was and jumped down to deal with the horse. "You can go inside," he said, handing her the bag. "It's unlocked. I'll be in when I've got him settled." She took the bag and went up the porch steps. He heard the door open and close. When he came in 20 minutes later, stamping the cold off his boots on the porch, he found that she had not stood in the hallway waiting for him. She had instead found the kitchen, located the wood stove, and was in the process of building it up from the low coals he'd left that morning. She had her coat hung on the peg by the back door and her sleeves rolled up, and she was feeding wood into the stove with the efficient movements of someone who had done this particular task roughly 10,000 times. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, caught off guard by the sight of someone else in his kitchen. It had been a long time. "I hope this is acceptable," she said, without looking up from the stove. "It is very cold." "That's fine," he said. Yes, go ahead." The fire caught properly, and she closed the stove door and straightened up. The kitchen was warmer already, or at least it felt that way. "I will need to see what supplies you have," she said, looking around at the shelves with the appraising eye of someone taking inventory. "So I can plan." "Tomorrow's fine for that." "Yes." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd been indoors, in the light. "Where do I sleep?" He showed her the room off the back hallway. Small, with a window that faced east so it caught the morning light, a bed with a good mattress, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall for clothes. It wasn't much, but he'd cleaned it out the week before and put fresh linens on the bed, and he'd left a small oil lamp on the dresser already lit, which cast the room in a warm enough light that it didn't look too bare. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. He couldn't read her expression. "This is a good room," she said finally. "It's modest." "No." She said it firmly, and something in her tone told him she was comparing it to other places she had slept, and that this room was winning that comparison without much contest. "It is a good room." Cole left her to settle in and went to bed himself, lying on his back in the dark and listening to the wind hit the side of the house, and thinking that he had no idea whatsoever how this was going to work out. Morning came early and gray, the sky a flat sheet of pewter cloud promising snow. Cole was up at 5, as always, because his body had decided years ago that sleeping past 5 was a kind of weakness it wasn't willing to tolerate. He dressed, pulled on his boots, and came down the stairs expecting to make his own coffee the way he always did, badly, in a pot that he never cleaned properly because he was the only one who had to drink it, Anya was already in the kitchen. She had been up before him. He didn't know by how long, and had not only made coffee, but made it in a way that filled the kitchen with a smell that was so much better than his usual effort that it was almost embarrassing. She had also found the oats he'd forgotten he had, and made something with them on the stovetop that involved butter and appeared to have actual texture. She set a bowl in front of him when he sat down at the table, and put the coffee beside it, and then went back to whatever she was doing at the counter, which appeared to be making a list. He ate a spoonful of the oats. They were good, genuinely good, with a slight sweetness that he couldn't identify the source of. "What's in this?" he asked. "Dried apple," she said without turning around. "You had some in the back of the shelf. It was not completely gone." A brief pause. "I found the state of your supplies." Her tone on that last sentence was carefully neutral. "I keep meaning to get to the store," he said. "Yes." She turned around and held up the list. "These are what we need. Today, if possible." She put the list on the table beside his bowl. "The salt is almost gone. The flour is gone. You have no lard, no dried beans, no rice. You have coffee, which is good, and oats, which is nearly gone. You have 2 tins of something." She paused. "I did not open them because the labels are missing." "Beans," he said. "Probably." Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes suggested she had already figured that out and was being diplomatic. "I will go to the store today," she said. "If you can give me money for supplies." "I'll take you. You don't know where things are yet." She nodded once. Practical. Efficient. She went back to her list. Cole ate his oats and drank his good coffee and watched, out of the corner of his eye, this stranger moving around his kitchen like she was already calculating how to make it work better, and felt something he hadn't felt in his own house in a very long time. He couldn't name it exactly. Not comfortable, quite. Something adjacent to it. Something that had to do with the smell of coffee made properly, and the sound of another person moving around, and the gray morning light, and the fact that the stove was warm. He finished eating and stood up. "I'll be at the office until 8, he said. "Come by and I'll take you to the store." She nodded. He put on his coat and his hat and went out into the cold morning, and it was only when he was halfway down the street that he realized he'd said thank you for the oats, which was something he couldn't remember doing in recent memory. He wasn't sure when that had stopped being a habit. Ruth Calloway saw them at the store. Of course she did. Ruth saw everything at the store because the store was where everyone went. And Ruth had the memory of a court stenographer and the social antenna of a woman who had built her entire business on knowing what was happening in Black Hollow before it became common knowledge. She looked at Anya with the sharp, assessing look of someone sizing up a situation, and then she looked at Cole, and then she looked back at Anya, and her expression became something that Cole recognized with a sinking feeling as approval combined with plans. "You must be Miss Novak," Ruth said, coming around the counter with her hand extended. "I'm Ruth Calloway. I'm told I'm the one who started this whole thing." "The advertisement," Anya said, shaking her hand. Ruth's handshake was enthusiastic. "Exactly. I have lived here for 22 years, and I have watched this man eat beans from a tin for approximately 15 of them, so I consider this a civic improvement." "Ruth," Cole said, "it's true." Ruth was still looking at Anya with that appraising warmth. "Where are you from, honey?" "Bohemia." "Where's that?" "Central Europe, Austrian Empire." "Oh, how wonderful." Ruth clearly had no idea where Bohemia was, but wasn't going to let that stop her from being enthusiastic. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Work," Anya said, simply, directly, in a way that closed the door on further questions without being rude about it. Ruth, who was experienced enough to recognize a closed door, pivoted gracefully. "Well, you let me know if you need anything, and come talk to me if you need to know anything about town, people, places, who to avoid." She lowered her voice on the last part in a theatrical way and glanced sideways at Cole. "I have opinions." "I'll make sure not to leave her alone with you for more than 5 minutes," Cole said. Ruth laughed, loud and genuine, and went back behind her counter. Anya moved through the store with the list she'd made, picking things off shelves and checking them against what she'd written with the focused attention of someone who was not going to forget anything or buy anything unnecessary. Cole followed along and paid when she brought things to the counter and tried not to think about how much the bill came to, and mostly succeeded. On the way back, Anya carrying one bag and Cole carrying two, she said, "She is a good woman." "Ruth?" "Yeah, she means well." A beat. "She also knows everyone's business." "Yes, I could see that." Anya was quiet for a moment. "It will not take long before everyone knows about me." "Already started, probably." She nodded, unsurprised. "And what will they say?" Cole thought about lying, then discarded it. She hadn't struck him as someone who would appreciate it. "Depends on the person," he said. "Some folks don't much care for foreign people. Don't take it personal." "How would I take it?" she said, with a dryness that surprised him. "I have been foreign my entire time in this country. I am used to it." He didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't offer one. They walked back to the house through the cold air, and the first flakes of the promised snow began to fall. The whispers started within the week. Black Hollow was not a cruel town, exactly. It had its share of decent people. Ruth, Doc Hessler, the pastor, several of the ranching families who had built their spreads through honest work and had the calloused hands and straight backs to show for it. But it also had Edna Marsh, who had been the town's chief architect of disapproval for 30 years and showed no signs of retirement. And it had a collection of men at the saloon who had never in their lives met a foreign woman and weren't sure they wanted to start now. The whispers that spread through town were not all the same. Some were merely curious. Who is she? Where is she from? What do we know about her? Some were suspicious. Why is a single woman living under the sheriff's roof? What kind of arrangement is that? Doesn't seem proper. Some were darker, the kind that attached to foreign accents and unpronounceable names and faces that don't look like the faces people grew up around. Anya walked into all of it the second week when she went to the general store alone. Cole found out about it later from Ruth, who had been there and who was clearly furious on a slow, controlled burn when she told him about it. "Edna Marsh," Ruth said. She said the name the way other people say bad weather. Made a point of speaking loudly to Margaret Holt about how it was a shame when a man didn't know any better than to bring and she used a word, Cole, that I won't repeat in my own store, into his home. Cole felt his jaw tighten. "Your Miss Novak stood there and heard every word of it," Ruth continued, "and she didn't flinch, didn't say anything. Just finished purchasing what she came for, said good day to me, and walked out." Ruth shook her head slowly. "I've never seen anyone absorb a hit like that and stay so still." Cole went home and found Anya in the kitchen making bread. The dough was on the floured board and she was working it with her hands in the practiced, rhythmic way of someone who had been making bread since they were old enough to stand at a counter. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. "Ruth told me about what happened at the store," he said. Her hands didn't stop. "It was nothing. It wasn't nothing." She looked up at him then, across the kitchen, flour on her hands and on the front of her apron. "What do you want me to say, Sheriff? That it hurt?" "Of course it hurt. It always hurts." She went back to the dough. "But I cannot stop people from saying things. I can only choose what I do next." "I could talk to Edna Marsh." "Please don't." She said it firmly. "That would make it worse. I am a stranger in this town and I need to earn my place, not have it given to me by someone else fighting my battles." She paused, pressing the heel of her hand into the dough. "I have never had anything given to me. I don't want to start now." Cole leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. He wanted to say something useful and could not locate anything useful to say. "All right," he said finally. She nodded. He went to his office to do paperwork that didn't need doing as urgently as he pretended it did, mostly because he needed somewhere to put the anger that had nowhere productive to go. December arrived like a creditor who'd been patient long enough. The snow that had been falling lightly, decoratively, through November became something serious in the first week of December. Real mountain snow, heavy and determined, piling against the sides of buildings and drifting across the road until the morning trips to the store required actual planning. The temperature dropped. The wind from the north found new and creative ways to get through the gaps in the walls, and Cole found himself spending evenings with a can of grease and strips of cloth, sealing cracks he'd been meaning to deal with for 2 winters. Anya helped without being asked, holding the lantern while he worked, identifying gaps he missed, doing the low sections of the wall herself while he did the upper ones. They worked in the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of two people with a shared task who didn't need to narrate it. "You've done this before," he said, watching her pack grease into a particularly bad crack near the floor. "My grandfather's house," she said. "Every autumn. The house was old." She pressed the cloth in firmly. "He taught me how to do it the right way. He said a house is like a person. You cannot ignore the small problems, or they become large ones." Smart man. He was. She sat back on her heels and looked at the section of wall she'd done. "He died the winter I was 12. After that, I did it myself." She said it in a matter-of-fact way that wasn't asking for sympathy, just stating what had been. Cole recognized that particular tone, the one that meant this happened and I survived it, and now it's just a fact. He used it himself often enough. "What about your parents?" he asked. "My mother died when I was 9. My father—" A pause. "He was not a man who was good at being a father after that." She stood up, brushing her hands on her apron. "My grandfather was better." She handed him back the lantern and moved to check the window frame, and Cole held the light up and didn't ask anything else, and felt, in the way he sometimes did late at night in the quiet, the strange weight of all the things two people can survive without anyone noticing. The first real crisis came on a Thursday in the second week of December. Cole came back from his rounds at 4 in the afternoon to find smoke coming out of the kitchen in a way that was wrong, too much of it, the wrong color, and heard, before he even reached the porch, a sharp cracking sound followed by what he would later describe to Doc Hessler as language I didn't know women knew. He came in through the back door to find Anya standing in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, the wood stove open, smoke billowing out from around the pipe joint where it connected to the wall, and a small fire going in the corner of the stovetop that she had evidently just managed to smother with the towel. "The damper is broken," she said without preamble. Her eyes were watering from the smoke. "And the pipe joint has separated. We need to open the windows." They opened the windows. The cold came in like a physical force, but it took the smoke with it. Cole examined the pipe joint. She was right. It had pulled apart at the ceiling fitting, probably from years of heat expanding and contracting the metal, and found the damper lever was bent at an angle that meant it had stopped functioning correctly some time ago. He had not noticed this because he used the stove as little as possible. "How long has the damper been like this?" Anya asked. "I'm not sure." She looked at him. "A while," he said. "The pipe also." She pointed at the ceiling joint. "This has been pulling apart for a long time. Did you not see?" She stopped, looked at the stove, then looked at him. "You were not using the stove very much." "I mostly use the fireplace in the main room." Another look. This one said, quite clearly, "You were living in your own house like a man camping in it." He didn't dispute it. "I can fix the damper," he said. "The pipe joint I'll need a part from the hardware store." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight we use the fireplace." She paused. "We can cook on the hearth if I have the right pan. Do you have a cast iron?" He found the cast iron skillet in the back of a low cabinet and handed it over. Anya looked at it. It was in genuinely terrible condition, the surface dull and flaking, and her expression said several things that she did not say out loud. They ate that night in the main room by the fireplace, where Anya had managed to produce, out of limited resources and a cast iron skillet she had to reseason before she could use it, something with salt pork and potatoes and dried herbs that was better than anything Cole had cooked for himself in years. He said so. "This is basic," she said, but she looked at the fire when she said it, and he thought he might have seen something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The first time he'd seen anything like it on her face. Dictate. He fixed the damper the next morning, lying on his back under the stove in a way that was neither dignified nor comfortable, and she brought the part back from the hardware store in the afternoon. She went alone, which she was doing more often now, navigating the town with a quiet determination that he found himself watching from the window sometimes, though he didn't examine why. And he fixed the pipe joint by 5 o'clock. She tested the stove, watched the smoke go up correctly, and nodded. "Good," she said. "Were you doubting me?" She turned to look at him. That recalibration thing again in her expression, the slight adjustment she made sometimes when he said something unexpected. "No," she said, and then, after a pause, "Were you?" He found to his own mild surprise that he was almost smiling. "No," he said. Christmas came and went quietly. Cole had never made much of it. It was a holiday for families, he had always thought, and he had been short on those for a while. But Anya, it turned out, had opinions about Christmas that he had not anticipated. She didn't ask his permission or his input. She simply, over the course of the week before, found a small pine tree at the edge of the property and cut it herself, a task that clearly cost her considerable effort given the frozen ground, and brought it inside and stood it in the corner of the main room. She made decorations out of things she found: scraps of cloth, small pieces of wire bent into shapes, dried berries threaded on string. It was modest and slightly lopsided, and not at all like the elaborate decorated trees he'd seen in shop windows in larger towns. He came home one evening and found it standing there, lit by the fireplace, and stopped in the hallway and looked at it for a long moment. "I hope you don't mind," she said, appearing from the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron. "In my country this is important. The tree. I know it is perhaps not—" "It's fine," he said. "It's good." She looked at him, then at the tree. "It is not very impressive," she admitted. "No," he agreed. He studied it. The wire ornaments caught the firelight in small, irregular ways. "It's the best tree I've had in this house." Anya looked at him, and this time what crossed her face was unmistakably a real smile. Small, controlled, like she wasn't sure how much of it to let out. But it was there. "I made cake," she said. "It is not quite right because I could not get all the ingredients, but it is close." He ate 2 pieces of a dense spiced cake that she said was called vanochka in Czech, or something like it, modified for available ingredients, and told her honestly that it was good, because it was. She ate 1 piece herself, at the other end of the table, and they sat in a not uncomfortable silence with the fire going and the lopsided tree in the corner. And Cole thought that this was the first Christmas in a long time that had felt like anything other than a day he was waiting to get through. He didn't say that, but he thought it. January was brutal. The temperature dropped to levels that turned the world outside into something hostile and beautiful in equal measure. The kind of cold that makes the air hurt when you breathe it in, that turns windows into sheets of frost, that kills poorly maintained animals and unprepared travelers, and reminds everyone who lives through a Montana winter exactly why they chose to live there. The house held. Cole had built it well, and Anya's early winter work on the drafts and gaps had made it hold better. The stove ran steady, and the wood pile, Anya had added to it in December, splitting wood herself on the days when the cold was endurable, until Cole had started doing it alongside her because she was clearly going to do it regardless, and it was faster with 2 people, kept them in fuel. The days had a rhythm now that Cole had not experienced in years. He was up at 5, she was up before 5. There was coffee when he came down. He went to his office by 7, came home for dinner at midday, went back out for afternoon rounds, was home by 6 or 7 depending on what the day had brought. Supper was on the table or nearly on when he came in. After supper, they sometimes sat in the main room, he reading or going over paperwork, she doing mending or writing letters. She wrote letters, he noticed, long ones, in a language he didn't recognize, in handwriting that was different from the careful English of her first letter to him, looser and faster, like her real voice. He didn't ask who she wrote to, she didn't ask what he read. They inhabited the same space with a kind of respectful distance that was, he recognized, a very specific kind of silence. The silence of 2 people who are aware of each other without being sure what to do about it. There was an evening in the middle of January when the wind was loud enough to make conversation difficult, and they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace. And at some point, Cole looked up from his paperwork and found her looking at him with an expression he couldn't decode. And when their eyes met, she looked down at her mending immediately. He went back to his paperwork and didn't say anything, but for the rest of the evening, he was aware, in a way he hadn't been before, of exactly how far apart their chairs were, and exactly how loud the wind was, and exactly how warm the fire was making the room. He realized with a certain amount of alarm, going to have to think about this carefully. He arrested a man named Bart Duchamp in the last week of January. Duchamp was not from Black Hollow. He had come through from somewhere north, doing some unclear combination of trading and intimidation, and had gotten into a disagreement with one of the saloon's regulars that ended with a broken jaw, the regulars, and a chair through the front window, also the regulars, which seemed to Cole to demonstrate a certain creativity. By the time Cole arrived, Duchamp was on his fourth whiskey and speaking loudly about how sheriffs in this part of the territory were going to mind their own business or find out what happened to people who didn't. The conversation that followed was short and culminated in Duchamp in the jail cell and Cole with a split lip where he'd caught an elbow badly. He came home at midnight with blood dried on his chin and his coat torn at the shoulder seam. He had thought Anya would be in bed. It was midnight. The house was dark when he rode in. But there was a lamp on in the kitchen, burning low, and she was at the table when he came in through the back, wrapped in a heavy shawl, a cup of something hot in front of her. She took one look at him and said nothing. She got up and went to the shelf and came back with a cloth and the small medical kit that had appeared in the kitchen sometime in December, which he had not put there himself. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." She looked at him with an expression that said this was not a statement she found credible. He sat down. She cleaned the cut on his lip with a careful, impersonal efficiency that was more gentle than it looked. He stayed still and let her do it and looked at the wall over her shoulder. "The other man?" she asked. "He'll have a headache," Cole said, "and some time to think. Your coat is torn." "I know. I will fix it tomorrow." She said it plainly, not as an offer, but as a statement of what was going to happen, the same way she said most things, and Cole felt something tighten in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the elbow to the face. "You don't have to wait up," he said. She was putting the medical kit back together, moving efficiently in the lamplight. "I was not waiting up," she said. "I could not sleep." "Why not?" She didn't answer immediately. She closed the kit and set it aside and picked up her cup, wrapping both hands around it the way you do with something warm when you're cold, and looked at the table. "I heard the horse," she said, "when you rode out. I did not know why at that hour." A pause. "I found that I was—" She stopped, started again. "I was not sleeping." Cole looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and the kitchen was full of shifting shadows, and she was looking at the table and not at him. "I'm all right," he said. He said it quietly. She looked up. Their eyes met across the lamp. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." The wind rattled the window in its frame. The lamp flickered. Neither of them said anything else. After a minute, she stood up, took her cup, said goodnight, and went to her room. Cole sat at the kitchen table alone and listened to the wind and looked at the medical kit she'd left on the shelf. He'd had that kit for 6 years and never once thought to move it to somewhere useful. He stayed at the table for a long time, with the lamp burning low, and didn't try to tell himself that what he was thinking about wasn't what it was. February came, and the snow kept falling, and the days began to lengthen by increments so small you could only notice if you were paying attention. Cole was paying attention. The town had largely come around on Anya Novak, or at least the reasonable portion of it had. Ruth Calloway had, in the months since Anya's arrival, made a point of publicly defending her at several key moments, which in a small town was a more powerful force than Cole had sometimes appreciated. Ruth had also somehow gotten Anya to teach a bread-making afternoon at the store for some of the other women in town, which had produced, according to Ruth, who reported back like a field correspondent, 3 very good loaves of bread and one extremely interesting conversation about how bread was made differently in different countries. She was marvelous, Ruth told Cole, with the satisfied look of someone who has executed a plan correctly. She didn't try to be someone she's not. She just talked about bread, and people responded to it. "She's good at that," Cole said, which surprised him when he heard it, because he hadn't known he'd been observing it closely enough to say. Ruth looked at him in a way that he recognized as the precursor to a comment he did not want to hear. "I have paperwork," he said, and left. The conversations he and Anya had now were longer than they'd been in November. Not much longer. She was not a chatty woman, and he had never been a chatty man, and their silences were still more frequent than their words. But the conversations that did happen had gotten deeper in the way of conversations between two people who have been close enough together for long enough that they've started to run out of surface. She told him over supper one night in February about why she'd left Bohemia. It came out in pieces, not all at once, not like a confession, but more like how things come out when the other person has stopped seeming like a stranger. Her husband, she had been married briefly, to a man who had seemed to be one thing and turned out to be another. He had died of a fever in the 3rd year of their marriage, which she delivered without apparent grief, which told Cole more than grief would have. After that, there had been very little reason to stay in a country that had always felt like it was built for other people. "So you came here," Cole said. "So I came here." She looked at the window. Outside, snow was falling again, slow and steady. "I was told it was a country where a person could become something, that what you had been was not always what you had to stay." "And has it been?" She turned back to look at him. The question sat between them for a moment. "I'm still finding out," she said. Cole looked at his coffee cup. "Me too," he said quietly, and it was such a small admission that it barely sounded like one, but she heard it, and he saw that she did, and they were both quiet after that in a way that was different from their usual quiet, fuller, somehow, heavier. He did not examine that particular quality of silence too closely, but he did not forget it. The month of February held on. The cold held on. The snow held on. And in the house at the north end of Black Hollow, where the wind came down from the mountains and hit first, something else held on too. Something neither of them had named, because naming things makes them real, and real things can be taken away, and they had each lost enough things to know that this particular truth went very deep. But it was there. The way that heat is there in a room when a good fire has been burning long enough. Not just in the stove, but in the walls themselves, in the wood and the plaster, in the structure of the place. You can let the fire go out, and the room will hold the warmth for a while. And if you've been cold long enough, that kind of warmth is not a small thing. Cole Mercer lay awake at night and listened to the house settle in the cold, the small sounds of timber contracting, the wind finding the eaves, the distant sound of the town settling toward sleep. And somewhere on the other side of the house, in the room with the east-facing window, he knew, without being able to say how he knew, that Anya Novak was also awake, looking at the ceiling, thinking about something that she hadn't found the words for yet. Spring was still months away. He told himself that was fine. He told himself they had time. He was not entirely sure he believed it. March arrived the way it always did in Montana, dishonestly. The first week gave them 3 days of something that almost resembled warmth, pale sunlight coming through the windows at an angle that was different from February's angle, and Anya opened the kitchen window on the second of those days and stood there for a full minute just breathing the air, which still had cold in it, but a different kind of cold, a retreating kind. Cole came in from the barn and found her like that and said nothing, just hung his coat on the peg and poured himself coffee, and they existed in the same kitchen with the window open and the outside air coming in, which felt, after months of keeping everything sealed against the cold, like a small and private luxury. Then the fourth day arrived and dropped 14 inches of snow in 11 hours, and that was March being honest. Cole came back from his afternoon round so covered in it that Anya looked at him from the kitchen doorway and said, without any particular inflection, "There is a broom on the porch." "I know where the broom is." "Then you know what to do with it before you come inside." He used the broom. He came in his socks, leaving his boots on the mat, and she handed him a towel for his hat and coat without being asked, and he took it without thanking her because by March they had gotten past the kind of politeness that required narrating every small exchange. Things passed between them: towels, coffee cups, the salt, a tool he needed, her reading glasses when she'd left them in the other room, with the easy economy of people who had learned each other's rhythms without meaning to. That was the thing that was happening, slow and steady as the snow outside. They were learning each other. Not in any deliberate way. Not in the way Cole would have described as getting to know someone, which implied intention and conversation and effort. More like how you learn a house, not by studying it, but by living in it, until the third step that creaks becomes something your foot knows to avoid without your mind having to tell it. He knew she took her coffee without sugar, but would accept a small amount if there was nothing else. He knew she woke at 4:30 regardless of what time she'd gone to bed. He knew she went quiet when she was thinking hard about something. A specific quality of quiet that was different from her ordinary quiet, and that pressing her for conversation during it was unproductive. He knew the scar on her left hand, just below the knuckle of her index finger, was from a kitchen knife and not, as he had briefly and absurdly wondered, from anything more dramatic. "I was 12, she'd said once when she caught him looking at it, cutting bread. My grandfather told me I was going too fast. Were you? Yes. A pause. I am still sometimes going too fast. He didn't know what she meant by that exactly, but he thought about it more than once afterward. What she knew about him, he could only guess at, but he had the uncomfortable sense that it was more than he'd intended to give away. Anya Novak watched things. Not in any intrusive or obvious way. She didn't stare, didn't pry, didn't ask questions he hadn't offered entry points for. But she was observant in the way that some people are observant, the way that comes from years of needing to read situations quickly and correctly because the cost of misreading them was too high. She watched, and she filed things away, and occasionally she acted on what she'd observed without comment, which was more disconcerting than if she'd commented. Like the week in early March when she came back from the store with a packet of the particular tobacco Cole preferred, which he had never mentioned to her and had not put on any list. He looked at it on the kitchen table and then at her. Ruth told me, she said before he could ask. Of course she did. She also told me you haven't been sleeping well. Cole looked at Ruth's name on the tobacco packet and made a mental note to have a conversation with Ruth about the limits of helpfulness. I sleep fine, he said. Anya said nothing. She put the rest of the groceries away. The truth was that he hadn't been sleeping well. It had started in late February and gotten worse in March. Nothing dramatic, no nightmares, nothing he could put a name to. Just the ceiling at 2 a.m. and his own thoughts moving around each other in circles, and a low-grade restlessness that made the bed feel wrong and the house feel smaller than it was. He knew, in the part of himself that he tried to keep separate from the part that made decisions, what the restlessness was about. He knew the way you know about a stone in your boot. You can keep walking, you can get used to it to a degree, but it's there. The difficulty was that he had very little experience with this particular problem. Cole Mercer had spent the better part of 3 years building his life around a set of clean, manageable facts. He had a job, he did it well, he required nothing from anyone, and nothing required anything significant from him in return. It was a life with no exposed edges, nothing that could snag. He had arrived at this arrangement after a period of his life he didn't think about directly, the way you don't look directly at a very bright light, and he had found it. Not happy, exactly, but survivable, predictable, safe. Anya Novak was, by the end of March, none of those things. She was not predictable, she was not safe, and she had done nothing to make herself either of those things. She had simply been herself, consistently and completely, from the day she stepped off the train with her worn leather bag and her careful English and her expression that said, I have survived worse than this. And that, it turned out, was the thing Cole had not been prepared for. He could have managed someone decorative. He could have managed someone needy or demanding or incompetent. He had built himself a fortress of self-sufficiency, and the thing that none of his defenses were designed for was someone who was also self-sufficient, who asked nothing from him, who made herself useful and made his house feel alive, and then sat at the other end of the fireplace every evening and made absolutely no demands whatsoever. It was, he thought one night at 2 a.m. while staring at the ceiling, a profoundly inconvenient situation. The trouble got more concrete on a Tuesday in the second week of March, when Cole came home at midday for dinner and found the kitchen empty and the food on the stove untended, which had never happened before. He turned the heat down under the pot and looked around the house and didn't find her inside, and went out to the barn and found her there, sitting on a hay bale in her coat, looking at something in her hands. It was a letter. He could see that much from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. The wind was loud, and he stood there for a moment before she looked up and saw him, and the expression on her face before she rearranged it was something he hadn't seen there before. Not sadness exactly, something flatter and more tired than sadness. Resignation, maybe, with a grief underneath it. She folded the letter quickly. The food, she said. I forgot. I'm sorry. It's all right. What's wrong? Nothing. She put the letter in her coat pocket, stood up. Anya? She stopped. He had used her given name perhaps 4 times in 4 months, and each time had been accidental, and each time she had registered it in a way that was too small to describe but too consistent to ignore. Who's the letter from? He asked. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, My sister. He hadn't known she had a sister. Is she all right? She is. Anya stopped, started again. She is in Chicago. She has been sick. She is better now, she says. But she was very sick for several weeks, and she did not write to tell me because she did not want me to worry. A pause. She knows that I would have come. Would you have? Yes. No hesitation. She's the only family I have left. Cole looked at her standing in the cold barn, in her coat, with the letter in her pocket, and her face arranged into its usual composed lines, but something unsteady behind the eyes. Has she been sick before? He asked. Yes, she is. Her lungs are not strong, since she was a child. Anya looked at the wall of the barn. When I left Chicago, I told her I was going somewhere better, that I would send money when I could. Her jaw tightened slightly. I have sent what I can. It is not always enough. The wages I pay you are fair, she said quickly, and with a directness that told him she was not asking for more. They are fair, and I appreciate them. I am not... She stopped again, pressed her lips together briefly. I am not complaining. I am only... It is difficult sometimes, not being there. Cole nodded. He didn't know what to say that would be true and useful simultaneously, which was his usual test for whether to say something. He came up short. She is better now, Anya said, with the finality of someone closing a subject. I should go finish the dinner. It can wait a few minutes. She looked at him. Sit down for a minute, he said. The stew isn't going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she sat back down on the hay bale. He sat on a wooden crate across from her, not close, the appropriate distance, and the barn was full of the sounds of the horse moving in his stall and the wind against the walls and the quiet that was between them. What is her name? Cole asked. Anya looked slightly surprised, as if she'd expected a more practical question. Marta, she said. Older or younger? Younger, by 3 years. A small softening somewhere in her expression. She is very different from me. She talks too much. She makes friends easily. She laughs at things that are not very funny. The tone was affectionate in a way that was almost hidden, like she wasn't sure it was allowed. She sounds easier to be around than you, Cole said. Anya looked at him sharply. Then she saw his expression, and the sharp look dissolved into something he hadn't heard from her before, a short exhale, somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. Yes, she said. She is much easier. And then quietly, she would like you. Cole felt something happen in his chest, small and sudden, like a door opening unexpectedly. He looked at the horse and said nothing. She would say you are too serious, Anya added. She'd be right. Yes. Another pause. She says that about me too. They sat in the barn a little longer with the wind outside and the horse shifting and the hay smell around them and the letter in Anya's pocket and Marta in Chicago with her weak lungs and her easy laugh, 3 years younger and 1,000 miles away. Eventually, Anya stood up. The stew, she said. Right. They went back into the house. The stew was fine. They ate it without talking very much, but the silence was different from usual, softer, somehow, around the edges, as if something had been let out of it. The news about the letter was not the only difficult thing March brought. 3 days later, Cole dealt with a situation that had been building since January, a land dispute between 2 ranching families on the east side of the valley that had started as a disagreement about a fence line and had been escalating in the way that these things escalate when stubborn men and harsh winters and contested property are involved. By March, it had produced 2 incidents of fence cutting, one altercation that left a ranch hand with a broken arm, and enough bad blood on both sides to make Cole uneasy every time he thought about it. He spent 3 days riding between the 2 properties in cold that was still genuinely dangerous, trying to find a line between them that both families could live with, and came back each night exhausted and short-tempered and filthy from the road. On the 3rd night, he came in and sat at the table and realized, belatedly, that he'd ridden 40 miles that day on coffee and a piece of dried meat and nothing else. Anya set a plate in front of him without comment. Hot food, substantial, which she had evidently kept warm for him, even though it was well past 8 o'clock. He ate most of it before he said anything. How did it go? She asked. She was mending something at the other end of the table, not looking at him, but the question was real. Badly, he said. Better than yesterday. Not as good as I need it to be. What is the problem? He told her the basics, because she'd asked, and because laying it out sometimes helped him see it more clearly. The fence line, the history between the two families that went back a decade and had nothing really to do with the fence, the pride involved that made neither man able to accept a solution that looked like losing. She listened without interrupting, which he'd come to appreciate about her. A lot of people, he'd noticed, listened to things primarily so they'd know when it was their turn to talk. Anya listened like she was actually interested in the information. "The fence is not the problem," she said when he'd finished. "No. And they know it. Probably. So you need them to find a way to settle the real problem without admitting what it is." She held the mending up to the lamp to check her work. "That is harder." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, threading her needle. "In my grandfather's village, there were two families like this. They had been arguing since before my grandfather was born, about water rights." She paused. One year, the well they were both arguing about went dry in the summer. They had to dig a new one together. The argument stopped. Cole looked at her. "You're suggesting I dry up the well." "I'm suggesting that sometimes people need a reason to work together that isn't asking them to stop being angry." She glanced at him. "Is there anything they both need that they cannot get separately?" Cole sat with that for a moment. The East Valley in spring was going to have flooding problems. It did every year. And both properties needed the drainage ditch that neither had maintained because they were too busy arguing about the fence. "Maybe," he said slowly. She went back to her mending. He sat at the table after he'd finished eating, turning the problem over in his head, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and the sound of her needle going through cloth was quiet and steady. And he had the peculiar sensation of being in a moment that would not repeat itself, and wanting to keep it. It was not a practical thought, and he set it aside. But it left a mark, the way small things do when they happen at the right angle. He resolved the land dispute on the second day of April by raising, entirely by coincidence, he told both families, the issue of the spring flooding and the drainage ditch that was going to cause serious problems for the East Valley unless someone dealt with it before thaw. He suggested, also coincidentally, that two adjacent properties sharing the work on a shared problem was simply the practical approach. Neither man could disagree without looking like he was willing to let his own land flood out of spite. They shook hands on it 2 days later, still not quite looking at each other, but shaking hands. Cole came home and told Anya, who was making soup, and she turned from the stove and said, "Good," with a brevity that somehow contained more satisfaction than a longer response would have. "Your idea," he said. "Your execution," she said, and went back to the soup. He sat down at the kitchen table, still in his coat, and thought that he couldn't remember the last time he'd told anyone how a difficult day had resolved, because there had been no one to tell. He thought about that for a little while, about what it meant to have someone to come home to with the news of a day, good or bad. He'd had that once, a long time ago, and lost it, and had spent the years since then learning to be sufficient to himself, which he had done, which was fine. Fine, he thought. That word again. The word that meant surviving but not asking for anything. April settled in with its usual chaos, mud, flooding, the particular kind of cold that comes after the ice melts, which is somehow worse than the dry winter cold. The streets of Black Hollow turned to soup. The horses hated it. Cole hated it. Anya regarded it with the philosophical acceptance she brought to most things she couldn't change, and focused instead on the fact that the supply wagons could start getting through again, which meant proper flour and things she'd been making do without for weeks. She made bread the day the first good supply wagon came through, real bread with good flour, and the smell of it filled the house in a way that the winter's bread had not. And Cole came in from his rounds and stopped in the hallway just to stand there for a moment with his eyes closed, breathing it in. "You're letting the cold in," Anya said from the kitchen. He opened his eyes and came inside and closed the door. "The bread smells good," he said. "Yes, the flour is fresh." A pause. "It is remarkable what good ingredients do." "I wouldn't know," he said. "I've been eating my own cooking for 6 years." She appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a dish towel, and looked at him with an expression that was caught between sympathy and something that was definitely, unmistakably amused. "Yes," she said. "I know." He realized, with a slight shock of something adjacent to surprise, that he was smiling. A real one. Not the small controlled acknowledgments he usually offered. And she was looking at him smiling with that expression, The almost smile, the careful one. And they were standing in his hallway in April with the bread smell around them and something happening between them that neither of them had created intentionally and neither of them knew what to do with. "I'll get cleaned up," he said. "Supper in an hour," she said. They separated. Cole went upstairs and stood at the wash basin and looked at his own face in the small mirror he kept there and tried to remember the last time he'd smiled at someone in his own house and had them look at him like that. He couldn't. That was the most alarming thing about all of it. Not the feeling itself, which he had at least the vocabulary to name, even if naming it was a long way from doing anything about it. The most alarming thing was that somewhere between November and April, this arrangement he had entered into for purely practical reasons, warmth, meals, someone to keep the house from falling apart around him, had become something he actively did not want to end, and it would end. That was the thing sitting in the back of his mind with increasing clarity as April wore on and the days got longer and the snow kept retreating up the mountain slopes. Anya had been hired for the winter. The winter was ending. There had been no conversation about what came after, and he could not think about that conversation without feeling something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had, in the interest of honesty with himself, to acknowledge that he had become afraid. Not in any way he was used to being afraid. He had faced down enough armed men in bad situations to have a reasonable relationship with that variety of fear. This was different. This was the fear of a person who has, without meaning to, handed something valuable to someone else and is only now realizing what they've done, and that the something valuable cannot be taken back even if it needed to be. He didn't say any of this. It was April, and the snow was retreating, and Anya moved through his house and his days like she had always been there, and he was a man who had long practice at keeping things in the part of himself where they didn't cause trouble. It was just that the practice was getting harder. The evening that changed the balance was a Thursday near the end of April. It was cold still, but the clean cold of an almost spring night rather than winter's mean cold, and there was a half moon that turned the snow on the mountain slopes silver. Cole had come in at a reasonable hour for once. No crises, no disputes, an ordinary day. And after supper, they were in the main room, the fire burning well, the lamps lit. Anya was writing, not a letter this time, something else. He could tell by the way she held the pen. Slower, more deliberate. Her face had that concentrated look that he had learned to not interrupt. He was reading a month-old newspaper that Ruth had saved for him, which was something Ruth did because she thought he needed to stay connected to the wider world, which he found condescending and also appreciated. He became aware, after a while, that she had stopped writing. He looked up. She was looking at him, not the quick assessments she made and quickly disguised. Looking at him, steadily, in the firelight, with an expression that was open in a way her expressions usually weren't, like she hadn't gotten around to arranging it yet. He lowered the paper. She looked down at what she'd been writing. Then she said, quietly without looking up, "I wrote to Marta about you." He waited. She asked about where I was living, who I was working for. She tapped the pen against the paper once, lightly. I told her... Another pause. I told her it was a good place. That the work was... that it was more than I expected. He could hear the fire. He could hear the wind, which was mild tonight, just touching the eaves. "What else did you tell her?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. She looked up at him, directly, the way she did when she had decided to be honest about something. "I told her the man was... that he was not what I expected. From the advertisement." She said the last part with a small, wry note, because she had told him early on that the advertisement had been somewhat sparse on information. "I told her he was good, that he was a good man." She paused. "She will read something into that. She reads into everything." Cole held her gaze across the firelit room. "Is she wrong too?" he asked. The question surprised her. He saw that. He'd surprised himself. She looked at him for a long moment, and the fire made the shadows in the room move slowly, and her expression did something complicated that he didn't have the full vocabulary for, wanting and afraid in the same moment, which he recognized because he had been carrying the same combination for weeks. "I don't know," she said. And then, more quietly, "I think she is not wrong." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Cole looked at the fire. He could feel his own heartbeat in an undignified way, and there were about 15 things he could say, and most of them were things he wasn't ready to say. And he was aware that the moment was fragile in the specific way of moments that matter, where the wrong word cracks the whole thing. So he said, "I'm glad you're here." It was a plain sentence, no ornamentation, no conditions on it. He said it at the fire, not at her, because some things are easier said sideways. He heard her exhale slowly. "I'm glad to be here," she said. They sat on opposite sides of the fireplace in his house at the edge of Black Hollow, with the half moon outside and the spring coming in and the winter not quite done, and neither of them said anything else. But the room was different after those words, the way rooms are different when something true has been said in them for the first time. Cole eventually went back to his newspaper, and Anya went back to her letter, and the fire burned down slowly. At some point she added wood to it without being asked, and he noticed, and didn't say anything, and the night went on the way nights do, passing, regardless of what is in them, toward morning. But he slept well that night for the first time in weeks, better than he had in longer than that, and in the morning the coffee was ready when he came down, and she was at the counter with her back to him, and he let himself think, that there were worse things in the world than this. Considerably worse things. The question of what came after spring was still there. He hadn't solved it. He hadn't come anywhere near it. But for the first time he thought that maybe he wanted to. May came in quietly, the way it does after a hard winter. Not with fanfare, but with small, incremental proofs that the cold was losing ground. The mud on the main street dried out by the second week. The aspens on the lower slopes came into leaf, pale green and trembling. The creek that ran behind the north end of town, which had been frozen solid since December, broke up and ran loud and brown with snowmelt, and Cole could hear it from his bedroom window at night, a sound he had always associated with the particular feeling of a season turning over. He noticed all of it more than he usually did. He wasn't sure what to do with that. The thing he and Anya had said to each other on that Thursday evening in April, "I'm glad you're here. I am glad to be here," had not been followed by anything more explicit. That was partly him and partly her, and partly the fact that some things, once said, need time to settle before they can be built on. He knew this the way he knew most things about people, slowly, after the fact, with a degree of certainty that arrived too late to be useful. They were careful with each other in May, not cold, nothing like that, but careful in the way of two people navigating around something fragile that neither of them wants to step on. The conversations continued, and the silences continued, and the rhythm of the house continued, but there was an awareness underneath all of it now that hadn't been there in December or January, a low-frequency hum that Cole felt most acutely at the moments when it was quietest, late evenings, early mornings, the pauses in the middle of an ordinary exchange when he would look at her and she would not quite look back. What he had not expected was that the complication would arrive from the outside. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he came to Black Hollow on a Wednesday in the second week of May, riding a good horse and wearing a suit that had no business being in a frontier town, which told Cole before the man had said a single word that he was from somewhere larger and had something to sell. Whitmore was the land agent for a railroad company pushing a new line through the territory. Cole knew about the railroad. The whole territory knew about the railroad, had been knowing about it for 2 years, the way people know about a storm that is happening somewhere else and moving toward them. Whitmore's job, as he explained it over coffee in Cole's office, with the pleasant efficiency of a man accustomed to making his pitch sound like a favor, was to assess the towns along the proposed route and identify opportunities for development. Black Hollow is well positioned, Whitmore said. He had a broad, comfortable face and the handshake of someone who gave a lot of them. The line coming through here would bring significant growth, new residents, new businesses, quite a transformation. "And what does the railroad need from Black Hollow?" Cole asked. Whitmore told him. The railroad needed a right-of-way through the north end of town. It needed the town council to approve certain land transfers. And it needed, Whitmore said, with the smooth indirection of someone making a large request sound small, the cooperation of the sheriff's office in managing the transition period, which would involve construction crews and an influx of workers and the particular variety of trouble that followed construction workers to every town they'd ever been in. Cole told him he'd look at the proposal and speak to the town council. Whitmore thanked him and went to take a room at the boarding house, which was the only accommodation Black Hollow offered, and Cole sat alone in his office and looked at the stack of papers Whitmore had left and thought about what a railroad meant, practically, for a town like this. He thought about it over supper, which Anya could tell. He'd been quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, tighter, somewhere behind his eyes. "Something happened today," she said. Not a question. He told her about Whitmore and the railroad. She listened, asking 2 or 3 precise questions. What land specifically? How many workers? Over what period? That told him she was thinking about the practical shape of it rather than the general idea. "It would change the town," she said. "Yes." "Is that bad?" He considered it. "Change brings trouble before it brings anything else," he said. "That's been my experience." She looked at the table. Then she said quietly, "Not always." He understood what she meant. He didn't say anything, but he understood. What the railroad brought, before it brought anything else, was a renewed interest in the foreign woman living in the sheriff's house. Whitmore was a social man, and he spent 3 days in Black Hollow meeting people and talking and gathering the kind of information that land agents gathered. And somewhere in that process he heard about Anya, who she was, where she was from, the loosely defined nature of her arrangement with Cole, and formed opinions about it that he then shared with the casual thoughtlessness of a man who didn't see why he shouldn't at dinner at the boarding house. Cole heard about it from Doc Hessler, who had been at the boarding house that evening, and whose expression when he came to Cole's office the next morning was the particular expression of a man delivering bad news he wishes he didn't have. "Whitmore said some things," Doc said. He was a careful man, the doc. Measured. He didn't embellish. About Miss Novak's situation, the nature of it." "What things?" Doc told him. The words Whitmore had used were not the same words Edna Marsh had used back in November, but they occupied the same territory. The implication that a foreign woman living alone in a man's house was there for reasons that a decent woman wouldn't be. The kind of talk that was dressed up in concern for propriety, but had something uglier underneath it. Cole sat with this information for approximately 30 seconds. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and went to find Gerald Whitmore. He found him at Ruth's store. He did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that a man who doesn't raise his voice when he has a badge on his chest is considerably more frightening than a man who does. He told Whitmore, in a conversational tone and with the economy of someone who has said difficult things to difficult people for years, exactly what he thought of the words Whitmore had used and what the consequences of using them again would be. Whitmore started to blink and bluster. Cole waited for him to finish and then said one more sentence. "Miss Novak is in my employ and is a woman of complete integrity, and I will hear nothing to the contrary from anyone in this town." Then he left. Ruth, who had heard the whole thing from behind the counter, told him later that the expression on Whitmore's face in the aftermath was one she would treasure. The problem was that Cole had not told Anya. He had not told her because he had handled it and considered it handled, and he examined this honestly later, because some part of him had not wanted her to know how often she was talked about, how often she was subject to other people's assessments and judgments, which was, he recognized, both protective and somewhat condescending, and he was still working out which of those two things it was more of when she came home from the store on Friday afternoon, and it was immediately apparent from her face that someone else had told her. She came in through the back door and put her basket on the table with a precision that indicated she was maintaining control of her movements with deliberate effort. "You spoke to the land agent," she said. "He was at the counter." He turned around. "Yes." "About me?" "About what he said about you." "Yes." She looked at him. Her jaw was set in a way he'd seen before, the way it got when she was managing something difficult by compressing it. "I asked you," she said, "in November. When Mrs. Marsh said what she said, I asked you not to fight my battles." This was different. "How?" "Because what he said was, it wasn't just unkind. It was a specific kind of suggestion that reflects on—" He stopped, tried again. "It wasn't something I could ignore. You could have told me first." She was right. He knew she was right before she said it. "Yes," he said, "I should have." "You should have." She picked up the basket and began taking things out of it, putting them on the shelves with the controlled movements she used when she was working through something. I do not need to be protected from knowing what people say. I am not fragile." "I know you're not fragile." "Then treat me like I'm not." The words were not loud, but they landed with weight. He watched her put a tin on the shelf, square to the edge. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She stopped, turned to look at him. The apology had surprised her. He could see that. He hadn't apologized often, and when he had, it had been for small practical things, not for something like this. The tension in her jaw eased slightly. "What did you say to him?" she asked. He told her, straight, without softening it. When he got to the last sentence, "Miss Novak is in my employ and is a woman of complete integrity," she was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I am?" she said. "In your employ." It wasn't an accusation, it was a question, asked carefully, and it was the most direct thing either of them had said since April, and it sat in the kitchen between them with a weight that was different from the weight of the argument. Cole looked at her. "No," he said. "That's not what you are." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the shelves. "All right," she said. That was all. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and the kitchen felt different for the rest of the evening. Not uncomfortable, but charged, the way air feels before a storm that is still deciding whether to come. The storm took a week to arrive. In the meantime, the question of the railroad moved forward. Cole attended 2 town council meetings that were loud and circular and arrived at conclusions that immediately became arguments about different conclusions, which was how Black Hollow had always made decisions. Whitmore attended both, patient and smiling in his inappropriate suit, and presented figures and projections that were either very good or very suspect, depending on which rancher you asked. Cole kept his own counsel on it. The railroad would come or it wouldn't. His job was to manage what came with it, not to have opinions about the town's future. That was what he told himself anyway. What he actually spent his time thinking about, in the margins of the council meetings, and the long afternoon rides and the nights when sleep was slow to come, was a different and more personal question about the future. Specifically, the fact that Anya's employment arrangement had been for winter, and winter was definitively over, and neither of them had raised this subject. And the longer it went unraised, the more it loomed. He had thought, in April, that maybe he wanted to do something about it. He still thought that. The thought had not gone away or diminished. If anything, it had gotten clearer and more insistent, the way that thoughts do when you've been trying not to examine them directly for too long. The complication was that wanting something and being able to reach for it were different things, and the distance between them, for Cole Mercer, had always been significant. He was not a man who discussed this, but there was an evening in the 3rd week of May when Doc Hessler stopped by the office after his rounds and ended up staying for a whiskey, which was an occasional habit between them, and somewhere in the course of the second glass, the doc said, with the measured casualness that meant he had been deciding whether to say it for some time, "You know, some of the talk about Miss Novak has changed." Cole looked at him. "Ruth's been putting the word around," Doc said, "about how she's been this winter, the bread she showed the women, what she did for the Henderson boy when he had that fever in February, before I could get there." He paused. "People talk, Cole. Not just the bad kind." "I know. She's becoming, I don't know the right word, known, I suppose." He turned the glass in his hands. "People know her now. Enough people that the Edna Marshes have less to work with." "That's good." "It is." Another pause. "She's good for you too. I say that as your physician and also as someone who has been watching you eat badly for 3 years. Cole said nothing. "I'm not prying," Doc said in the tone of a man who was absolutely prying but was at least being honest about it. I've known you a long time, Cole. I knew you before." He let that sit for a moment. "You seem different this year, and I think we both know why." Cole looked at his glass. "You're prying." "Yes, I am." Doc finished his whiskey and stood up. "Don't be an idiot about it," he said, with the affectionate bluntness of a man who had earned the right to it. "Whatever it is you're not saying to her, and I can see you're not saying it, say it. Some things don't wait forever." He left. Cole sat with the empty glasses and thought that everyone in his life apparently had very clear opinions about what he should do. The problem was that they weren't wrong. The storm arrived on a Saturday evening, the last Saturday in May. It was not a dramatic storm. Spring storms in Montana rarely were. They came in sideways, sleet and cold rain rather than snow. The cold not as killing as winter's cold, but mean in a persistent way. It hit Black Hollow at 7 in the evening, and by 8 the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the windows were loud with it. Cole had been out dealing with the situation at the saloon. Two of Whitmore's survey crew, who had been in town all week doing preliminary work, had gotten into a dispute with each other that had ended predictably and required the jailhouse for one of them overnight. He got home at 9, wet through and cold, and came in to find the house warm and lit, and Anya at the kitchen table with the letter she appeared to have read more than once, the pages slightly creased from handling. He hung his wet coat, pulled off his boots. She looked up when he came in. "You're soaked," she said. "Sleet." She got up without commentary and went to the shelf for a towel, and he took it, and she looked at the letter she'd left on the table while he dried off. "Is that from Marta?" he asked. She nodded. She sat back down but didn't pick the letter up, just looked at it. "What's wrong?" She pressed her lips together briefly. "Marta has an opportunity. There is a woman in St. Louis, a woman she knows from the Czech community there, who has offered her work, good work, in a boarding house, with a room included. Better for her lungs than Chicago." She paused. "She wants to go. She is asking if I think she should go." "Do you?" "Yes, it is a better situation." She looked at the letter. "She is also asking, she wants to know if I will come too, to St. Louis." She looked up at him then. "She says there is room for both of us, that we could be together." The sleet hit the kitchen window. The stove ticked. Cole sat down across the table from her, which put him in the same position they'd been in on the night he came home with the split lip in January, the lamp between them, the kitchen at night. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know." She said it plainly, which was how she said things she was genuinely uncertain about. 6 months ago, the answer would have been simple. "Of course. She is my only family. I have been alone for a long time." She touched the edge of the letter without unfolding it. "But that was 6 months ago. And now?" She looked at him steadily. "Now it is less simple." Cole sat with this. The rain against the window, the lamp, her hands on the letter. He had been, for 3 weeks, working himself up to a conversation that he had not managed to have. He had rehearsed versions of it late at night in a way that he found embarrassing when he thought about it clearly, because he was not a man who rehearsed things. He was a man who spoke plainly when he had something to say, except, apparently, when the stakes were high enough that plainness felt like standing in an open field with no cover. "When does she need an answer?" he asked. "She would go in July. She is asking me to come by June." A pause. "I have 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Cole turned that over. It was simultaneously too long and no time at all. "I need to think," he said. She looked at him carefully. "About what?" "About what I want to say to you." He held her gaze. "Before you make a decision." She was very still for a moment. The sleet was loud. "All right," she said. He nodded. He got up, said good night, and went upstairs, and lay on his back in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about how profoundly terrible he was at this particular variety of human experience. The 3 weeks that followed were the most uncomfortable of the entire winter, which was saying something. Cole went about his work with the outward steadiness that was his professional character. The railroad crew needed managing. The council needed managing. The ordinary business of the town needed managing. And inside of that steadiness was a man who was having a prolonged argument with himself about what he was willing to risk. The argument went like this. On one side, he had built his current life deliberately, after losing a version of it that had been different, and the losing had been bad enough that he had spent 3 years making sure nothing like it could happen again. The architecture of that protection was not complicated. Don't give anyone the ability to hurt you, and they can't. He had been competent at it. On the other side, he thought about the smell of bread in April. He thought about Anya in the barn with Marta's letter and the way she'd said she is the only family I have left. He thought about the Thursday evening in April. "I'm glad you're here. I am glad to be here." And the specific quality of the silence after it. He thought about what his life had felt like in October, before she came, and what it felt like now, and the distance between those two things was not small. He talked to Ruth, which he had not planned to do. It happened because Ruth could see something was wrong. She had always been able to see this. It was among her less welcome gifts. And she cornered him in the store on a Wednesday with the comfortable implacability of a woman who had outlasted every attempt at evasion for 22 years. Something's eating at you, she said. I'm fine. Cole. She set down the ledger she'd been pretending to work on. Sit down. He sat down on the stool by the counter, which he hadn't done since he was approximately 16, and Ruth had given him a piece of advice about a completely different and equally embarrassing situation. He told her about Marta's letter, and St. Louis, and the 3 weeks, and the conversation he hadn't had. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough for her that it told him she understood the seriousness. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. What are you afraid of? She asked. I'm not afraid. She gave him a look. It's more complicated than afraid, he said. Is it? She's been here 6 months, Ruth. I don't... He stopped. Started again. I don't know what she wants. I know what she said in April, but that's not the same as knowing if she wants... Have you asked her? He said nothing. Cole Mercer, Ruth said, with the exasperation of a woman at the end of her patience, you have arrested men twice your size without a second thought. You negotiated between the Hendersons and the Praetors, who have been trying to kill each other for a decade. You rode out into a blizzard in February to find that lost child from the Weston Ranch. She leaned on the counter. Are you genuinely telling me that talking to a woman is harder than all of that? Put that way, it sounded unreasonable. Different kind of hard, he said. Ruth softened slightly. Yes, she said. I know it is. She looked at him with an expression that had known him for a long time and still had affection left over after all of it. But I think you already know what you want to say. You just have to decide to say it. He left the store with no conclusions he hadn't had before, but with a slightly clearer sense of what the actual question was. Not what do you want? He had known the answer to that for weeks. The actual question was whether he was willing to say it out loud and face what happened after. What happened next was not his decision. It was Anya's, in the way that the things that change situations are often someone else's decision, the one that forces the hand. She came to his office. She had never come to his office before. She had no reason to. It was his professional space, and she understood the distinction between his professional space and the house. She came in on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after Marta's letter, while Cole was at his desk going through paperwork, and she knocked on the open door and waited. He looked up. She was in her coat, which meant she'd come from outside. From the store, maybe. Or from wherever she walked when she was working something out, which he'd noticed she did. Longer walks on days when something was occupying her. I need to write to Marta, she said. I have to give her an answer soon. Cole put down his pen. I know, he said. I have been waiting. She said it without any particular emotion, but directly. You said you needed to think about what you wanted to say. I have been waiting. I am not... She stopped, straightened slightly. I am not asking you to say anything. I am not asking you to... I understand that this situation is not... that I am your employee and that the terms of my employment... Stop, he said. She stopped. He stood up from behind the desk. He was not entirely sure what he was about to say, which was unusual, but some things apparently couldn't be rehearsed into readiness. I don't want you to go to St. Louis, he said. She looked at him. I don't want you to go anywhere, he said. I want you to stay. I should have said that 3 weeks ago. I should have said it before Marta's letter. I have been bad at this. He stopped. The words were coming out plainer than he'd intended, which was either wrong or right. I'm not good at this kind of thing. I haven't been for a long time. But I know what the house was like before you came, and I know what it's been like since, and I know which one I want. The office was quiet. Outside, the main street was going about its afternoon business. I'm not asking you to stay as my housekeeper, he said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. I'm asking you to consider, if you have any, if this is something that you... He stopped again, tried once more. I don't know how to ask this cleanly. Then ask it uncleaned, she said. He looked at her across the office. Her face was careful and open and afraid in a way he recognized because it matched something inside him exactly. Stay, he said. Not for a season. Stay. The word between them was very plain and very large. Anya stood in his office doorway in her coat, with the afternoon light behind her, and she looked at him for a long time. Her expression was doing that complicated thing, wanting and afraid, and something else underneath both of those, something that he could only read as a person deciding whether to trust a thing that they had been afraid to trust. "I have been living in other people's houses," she said slowly, "for 4 years, since I came to this country. Other people's kitchens, other people's rooms, doing work that was... It was work. It paid." She paused. "This house is not like that." "No," he said. "This house feels..." She stopped, pressed on. "When I come back to this house, at the end of the day, from the store or from wherever I have been, I feel..." She seemed to be looking for the word and finding it imprecise when she got there. "I feel that I am coming home. I have not felt that in a very long time." Cole said nothing. He waited. "I am afraid," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not someone who trusts easily. I have had reasons." She met his eyes. "But I think..." Her voice was quiet and steady. "I think I am more afraid of leaving than I am of staying." The afternoon traffic outside, the creak of the office settling. "I would have to write to Marta," she said. "Write to Marta," he said. "She will be very pleased with herself," Anya said. And there, finally, was the smile. The real one. Not the careful almost smile, but the actual thing. And it changed her face in a way that was not dramatic or soft or any of the things he might have expected, but simply, undeniably, her. He felt something unknot in his chest that he had not known was knotted until it wasn't. "She sounds like she usually is," Cole said. "Yes." Anya looked down briefly, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Yes, she usually is." They stood in his office with the afternoon outside and the decision made, or the beginning of a decision, which was its own kind of thing. Not an ending, but a door that had been chosen rather than walked past. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them. It was too soon for that, and they were both too careful, and there was too much to work out yet, in the particular and practical ways that things between people have to be worked out. But the door was there, and neither of them was walking away from it. The letter to Marta went out on a Friday, tucked into the weekly mail pouch that the writer took north to the territorial post. Anya had written it at the kitchen table on Thursday evening while Cole sat across from her with his paperwork, and she had written it in Czech so he couldn't read it, which was practical and also, he suspected, gave her room to say things she wasn't ready to say in English yet. He didn't ask what was in it. She didn't tell him. But when she sealed it and set it aside and looked up, her expression was the expression of someone who is committed to a direction and is now living with the fact of that commitment. Not regretful, but aware of the weight of it. "Done," she said. "Good," he said. They went back to their respective work, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the spring night was warm enough that the kitchen window was open for the first time since October, and the sound of the creek came through it distantly, still running loud from the snowmelt. What came after was not a transformation. Cole had half expected something to be different, the air in the house, the quality of the mornings, something. But things were, in their surface texture, largely the same. Coffee in the morning, his rounds, supper, the evenings. The same rhythms that had built themselves over 6 months continued, because they were the structure that both of them knew how to inhabit. The difference was underneath. It was in the fact that when he came home now, there was no question attached to it. No for how long, until when, what comes after spring. The question was gone, and what filled its absence was something quieter and more solid. Not certainty exactly. Neither of them was built for easy certainty, but a direction, a shared one. That was new. There were also, inevitably, practicalities. "We should talk about the arrangement," Cole said, on a Saturday morning about a week after the letter. He said it over coffee, which was where most of their real conversations happened, and he said it badly. Too stiff, too formal, which Anya indicated by looking at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to say something or let it pass. "The arrangement," she repeated. "You can't keep being my housekeeper," he said. "If you're going to stay, it's not right. The wages, the way it looks. It's not..." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about this also." And she wrapped both hands around her cup. "I think we should be honest about what we are doing and what we intend." She said it plainly, which was how she said things that were difficult. "We are two adults who are..." She paused. "Who have decided that they want to share a life. That is what we should say. To people." Cole nodded. "But," she said, and he could hear the but had weight behind it. I will not be someone who simply moves from one dependency to another. I came here to be useful, to earn my own way. She looked at him directly. I need you to understand that I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because I am choosing to stay. There is a difference. I know there is. I want to keep working, she said. Ruth has asked me before if I would like to help in the store some days. I would like to do that. Not because I need to, but because... She stopped. I need to be a person who does things, not someone who is kept. All right, he said. And then, because it needed to be said clearly, I wouldn't want you any other way. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once, decisive, and went back to her coffee, and the conversation was done in the way their conversations were done, abruptly, once the essential thing had been established, without elaboration. He told Ruth the following Monday, or rather he went to the store and started to tell Ruth, and discovered before he had gotten 3 sentences out that Ruth had already arrived at the correct conclusion through her own methods and was now attempting to be surprised in a way that was not convincing. Ruth, he said, I'm just saying, I think it's wonderful. Ruth, how long have you known? She had the grace to look slightly abashed. I had a strong feeling, she said, since about February. February? The way you talked about her. Without knowing you were talking about her. She shrugged, unapologetic. I'm observant, Cole. It's my greatest gift. It's your most aggravating quality. Same thing. She was fully smiling now. She came to talk to me too, a few weeks ago. He hadn't known that. About what? About you. Ruth tilted her head. She wanted to know. She asked me very carefully what kind of man you were. Before. What had happened to you to make you the way you are? Cole was quiet. I told her what I knew, Ruth said more gently. What everyone here knows. About Eleanor. The name was not one he heard often. People in Black Hollow had learned years ago not to raise it without invitation. Ruth said it carefully, watching him. What did she say? He asked. She said, Ruth considered. She said, that explained some things. And then she thanked me and bought her flower and left. She paused. She's a careful woman, Cole. She doesn't miss much. He absorbed this. The idea of Anya asking about him, trying to understand what she was dealing with before she made her decision, it was so completely consistent with who she was that it almost made him smile. She had done her due diligence on him the way she did her due diligence on everything, quietly, efficiently, without making a production of it. She knows, he said, about Eleanor. She knows something happened. I imagine she knows more than you've told her, Ruth said. She's good at filling in the gaps. He went back to his office and sat with that for a while. Eleanor Mercer, née Carol, who had come to Black Hollow 6 years ago as his wife, and left 2 years later as... what, exactly? His ex-wife was the legal term. The woman who had found, correctly, that she had married a man who was better at doing his job than being present in his own life, and had told him so, and had taken the morning train east and had written once from Denver to say she had arrived safely. He had not written back because he had not known what to write that was true and also kind. He had not, in the years since, talked about this to most people. Doc Hessler knew. Ruth knew. The town had known, in the way that small towns know things, and had mostly had the decency not to bring it up. He had not told Anya. He had not told her because it was not the kind of thing he led with, and because the winter had gone by in ways that had felt more present than past, and because talking about Eleanor meant talking about the version of himself that had failed her, which was a version he had spent 3 years trying to believe wasn't the only version. He rode home that evening later than usual, taking the long way around the north edge of town where the road ran beside the creek, and he thought about what he needed to say and how to say it, and by the time he got home he had not found the clean version, but had decided there wasn't one, and the untidy version was going to have to do. Anya was in the kitchen. Supper was on. She looked at him when he came in and read something in his face that made her set down what she was holding and turn to face him properly. "There's something I should have told you," he said. She waited. He told her about Eleanor. He told it plainly, without making himself more sympathetic than he deserved. That he had loved her, that he had been bad at showing it, that his work had been his primary occupation in a way that left insufficient room for a marriage, that she had been right to go. He told it standing at the kitchen counter with his coat still on because he'd started before he'd thought to take it off. And once he'd started, he didn't want to stop and break the momentum. When he finished, Anya was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" she asked. 4 years. We were married 2 years before that." She nodded slowly, processing. "Ruth told me there had been someone," she said. "She did not tell me the details." "I know. I am not—" She chose her words carefully. "I am not afraid of your history. I have my own." She looked at him steadily. "I am only asking you something." "What?" "The things that made it difficult then. Have they changed, or are you only hoping they have?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked him, and it hit the way direct questions hit when they land exactly on the thing you've been most afraid of. And he stood there in his coat in his kitchen and made himself think about it honestly rather than reaching for the easy answer. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "I think I'm different. I think the years changed some of it. But I can't promise you I've fixed things I didn't fully understand were broken." She looked at him for a long time. The stove ticked. The spring evening came through the open window. "That is an honest answer," she said. "It's the only one I have." "Then it is enough." She turned back to the stove. "Take your coat off. Supper is ready." He took his coat off, and they ate supper. And the conversation folded itself into the evening the way conversations did in this house. Fully said, and then done, without being carried past their natural end. June arrived and the days got long. The kind of Montana summer days that stretch past 9 in the evening with the sky still holding color, pink and gold fading to a deep blue that was almost but not quite dark. The railroad survey crew finished their work and moved on, taking Whitmore with them and his suit and his opinions, which improved the general atmosphere of Black Hollow measurably. The council voted, narrowly, contentiously, in the way the council voted on everything, to grant the right-of-way, which meant the railroad was coming, but not until next year, which meant the disruption was a future problem rather than a present one, which suited Cole. The town was different in June than it had been in November, and not just because of the season. The difference was harder to articulate, but Anya was part of it. She had started working at Ruth's store 3 days a week, which had placed her in the daily social current of Black Hollow in a way that her winter isolation, in the house, in the cold, in a town that had been suspicious of her, had not. People saw her behind the counter. They talked to her. She helped the Weston girl find the right fabric for a dress pattern and weighed out coffee beans for old Martin Presley, who was mostly deaf and appreciated that she spoke clearly and didn't raise her voice the way people did with the deaf, as though volume was the problem. And she told Ruth's nephew, who was 14 and working in the store on Saturdays, the correct way to stack canned goods so they didn't fall over, which was a thing Ruth had been trying to communicate for 3 years. She was becoming, as Doc Hessler had predicted, known. And known was different from foreign. Known was someone you had a context for, a set of small accumulated memories that added up to a person rather than a category. Cole watched this happen from the periphery. He was not a man who observed social things with great attention, but he could see the difference in how people spoke to her when he was at the store. The slight but real shift from wary to familiar. There was still Edna Marsh. There was always Edna Marsh. The confrontation came on a Tuesday, which was not a day that had previously distinguished itself in Cole's experience. He was not present for it. He heard about it from 3 different people by the end of the afternoon, which was a measure of how many people had witnessed it. Edna had come into the store while Anya was working and had said something. The accounts differed on exactly what, but the substance was consistent. A comment about the impropriety of Anya's situation, phrased in the particular way Edna had of making an attack sound like a moral concern. She had said it loud enough to be heard, which was the point. Anya had, according to all 3 accounts, put down what she was doing and turned to face Edna Marsh fully and said, in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly audible, "Mrs. Marsh, I have been in this town for 8 months. In that time I have worked hard, I have been honest, and I have made myself useful where I could. I have not asked anything from anyone that was not earned. I understand you have opinions about me that will not change regardless of what I do, so I am not speaking to you for your benefit. I am speaking so that anyone else who is listening understands that I am not ashamed of my life or my choices, and I will not act as though I am." Then she went back to what she'd been doing. Ruth, who had been the first person to tell Cole about it, was still almost vibrating with delight when she recounted it. She didn't raise her voice, Ruth said. Not once. She was calm as anything, and Edna she just stood there, and then she left. Good, Cole said. Cole, it was magnificent. I said good. He found Anya at the store at the end of the day, helping Ruth close up. He told her what he'd heard, or the outlines of it, watching her face. She shrugged slightly. I was tired of being careful around her, she said. I thought about what you said, that some people have opinions that don't change. I decided to stop performing for them. How do you feel? She considered this. Like myself, she said, which is good. He nodded. Ruth, across the store, was pretending very hard not to listen. Are you ready? He asked. Yes. She untied her apron, folded it. Ruth, I will see you Thursday. You certainly will, Ruth said warmly, not pretending anymore. They walked home together in the long June evening, which they had been doing more frequently since the weather improved. It was a 12-minute walk, and they took it at a pace that wasn't hurried, because neither of them was hurried. The town was settling towards supper hour, and the main street was thinning out, and the air had that particular quality of early summer evenings in the mountain west, warm and clear and faintly scented with pine from the slopes above. What happened today, Cole said, with Edna. I know some people will repeat what she said, not what I said, Anya said. That is how it works. Some. Not as many as there would have been in November. She considered this, looking at the road ahead. No, she agreed. Not as many. They walked a bit further. I have been thinking, she said, about something Ruth mentioned. Ruth mentions a great many things. She said, she told me about the circuit preacher who comes through in July, for weddings. She said it plainly, the way she said things she had decided to just say directly rather than circle around. She was not looking at him. I am not raising this I am not trying to push you towards something before you are ready. I only want to know if it is something you are thinking about also. Cole walked 3 more steps without speaking. The creek was audible from here, lower now than it had been in May, the snowmelt mostly run off. Yes, he said. I've been thinking about it. She nodded, said nothing, waited. I'm not good at the ceremony of things, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know you are not. It doesn't need to be a large thing. If it's something you would want. He paused. What would you want? She was quiet for a moment. Something real, she said. Not large, not a performance, just real. She glanced at him sideways. And I would need to write Marta. Of course. She will want to come. That's fine. She will talk a great deal. That's also fine. Anya made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. You don't know her yet, she said. No, he agreed. But I will. She looked at him when he said that. In the low evening light, her face was open in a way it almost never was in full light. All the careful management of expression relaxed, and she looked tired in a way that wasn't bad tiredness. The tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has only just begun to put it down. They reached the house. He opened the gate for her, which was a new habit that had developed without either of them marking its beginning. On the porch, before they went in, she stopped. He stopped beside her. The evening was around them, the sky overhead still pale blue, the first of the summer stars just becoming visible in the east. Cole, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for saying in the office that day, for saying it plainly. I should have said it earlier. Yes, she agreed. You should have, but you said it. He held the door open. She went inside, and the kitchen was warm from the day's heat, and the stove wasn't lit yet, and the house smelled the way it smelled in summer, different from winter, open, lighter, but still, underneath everything, itself. The conversation with Doc Hessler happened on a Thursday, and it was Doc who raised the practical dimension that Cole had been circling but not landing on. Have you thought, Doc said, with the careful phrasing of a man being delicate, about what legally needs to happen for her situation? Cole looked at him. What do you mean? She's here on what kind of documentation? Cole realized with an uncomfortable jolt that he did not know the precise answer to this. He had not thought about it in those terms. He thought about it now. He talked to Anya that evening. She was more informed about her own situation than he had been. She had always been more organized about practical things than he was. And she laid it out for him with her usual precision. She had come legally, papers in order. But her situation had been predicated on employment, and the question of what staying meant in a more permanent sense, the legal paperwork of it, was something that needed handling. "I have been worried about this," she said carefully. "I did not want to bring it up and make it seem like I was—" "Like you were what?" "Using the situation to solve a problem," she said. He looked at her. "Anya, you came here for work. You've worked. Nothing about what's between us is solving a problem." She looked at him steadily. "I know that. I needed you to know that I know it." "I do." She nodded. Then, "There is a lawyer in Billings. Ruth gave me his name." She paused. "I should go, soon, to understand what the process is." "We'll go together," he said. She started to say something, probably that she could handle it herself because she always thought she could handle things herself, and then she stopped and looked at him and said, "All right." The trip to Billings took 2 days round trip in the first week of June on the stage that ran weekly. They sat side by side on the stage, which was crowded with 4 other passengers and their luggage, and the road was rough in the sections where the spring mud had dried into ruts, and it was not a comfortable journey. But Anya had packed food for both of them in a way that suggested she had planned for the discomfort, and when the stage stopped at noon at a relay station, they ate outside in the mild air while the horses were changed, and Cole watched her eat half a sandwich and look out at the wide valley they were crossing, and thought that he had spent enough of his life on this earth doing things alone. The lawyer in Billings was a thin man named Eckhart, with an extremely organized desk and the no-nonsense practicality that Cole associated with people who spent their days reducing complicated human situations to their legal components. He asked questions, examined the documents Anya had brought, and told them what was needed in the direct way of someone who believed that people were better served by clarity than by comfort. It was manageable. It would require paperwork and a fee, and some time, but it was manageable. On the stage back to Black Hollow, in the late afternoon with the mountains ahead of them going gold in the long light, Anya said, "It is less complicated than I feared." "Usually is," Cole said. "Once you're looking at it directly." She glanced at him. "Is that also true of other things?" He thought about 6 months of not saying what he meant. "Not always," he said. "Sometimes it takes a while to look directly." She made the small sound that meant she was amused and wasn't going to say so. The evening they got back, Cole stood on the porch after Anya had gone inside, and he looked at the main street of Black Hollow in the summer dusk. The lights coming on in the saloon, smoke from the boarding house chimney, Ruth's store dark and locked for the night. The whole ordinary machinery of the place he had kept order in for 5 years. He had stood on this porch alone 1,000 times and looked at the same view and felt, if not unhappy, then the particular flatness of a man who has reduced his life to what he can manage. The door opened behind him. "Come inside," Anya said. "It's getting cold." It wasn't, particularly. The June evening was mild. But he turned and went inside, and the kitchen was lit and warm, and there was coffee on, and she had already put her coat away and was at the counter doing something efficient, and the house was alive in the specific way it had been alive since November, which was the way a house is alive when someone in it is paying attention to it. He sat down at the table. She set coffee in front of him. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. I know I said it before, in the office, and you said you were staying, but I want to ask you the other part. The part I didn't say clearly." She was very still. He was not a man who was good at this. He had known that going in, and he still didn't have a better version than the plain one. "I want you to marry me," he said. "That's what I want. Not just to stay and to be here in this house as mine and I'll be yours, and that's what it is." The kitchen was quiet. She looked at him across the table, across the coffee and the lamplight, and her expression was doing the complicated thing again. But this time he could read more of it than he usually could, because she was letting him. The wanting and the afraid, and underneath both of those, something that had been sitting there for a long time and was only now being allowed to show. "You said you were bad at ceremony," she said. "Yes." "That was not very ceremonial," she said. "No." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "When the circuit preacher comes in July." He waited. "Yes," she said. "That is my answer." He let out a breath he had been holding, he thought, for approximately 6 months. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She sat down across from him and they drank their coffee. And outside, the summer evening was settling into a proper dark, the stars coming out over the mountains in the long, slow way of high country summers. And the house held them the way it had held them all winter, imperfectly, with its drafts and its quirks and its floors that creaked in specific places. The stove that still needed watching, the window in the east bedroom that stuck when it rained. A real house. Not a perfect one. A home that two imperfect people had made without entirely meaning to. One cold November morning when a train came in 40 minutes late, and a woman with a worn leather bag stepped off it into the dark. Marta's answering letter arrived on a Friday, 2 weeks later. Anya read it at the kitchen table and then looked up with an expression that was exasperated and fond in equal measure. "She is coming," she said. "Good," Cole said. "She has 17 questions." "Also good." Anya looked back at the letter and shook her head, but the smile was there. The real one. The unguarded one. The one that changed her face. "She wants to know if you are handsome," she said. Cole considered this. "What are you going to tell her?" Anya looked at him across the kitchen, with the same careful, appraising look she had given him on the platform the night she arrived, in the dark, in the cold, when neither of them had known anything about what was coming. "I will tell her," she said, "that you are enough." He laughed, an actual laugh, short and surprised out of him, and she was smiling, and the kitchen was warm, and the summer outside the window was full and green, and it was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than that. Marta Novak arrived on the second Tuesday of July on the same train line that had brought her sister 8 months before. Except this time the train was only 12 minutes late, and the platform was not dark, and Cole was not standing alone. He was standing with Anya, which was different in every way that mattered. He had not entirely known what to expect from Marta. Anya's descriptions: she talks too much, she makes friends easily, she laughs at things that are not very funny, had given him an outline but not a person. The person who came down the train steps was shorter than Anya by several inches, with the same dark hair but worn loose rather than pulled back, and a face that was rounder and more immediately readable than her sister's. Where Anya's expressions were careful and controlled, Marta's were consecutive and unfiltered. Cole watched her scan the platform, find Anya, and produce an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that she made no attempt to manage. She came down the steps quickly, dropped her bag on the platform without concern for it, and embraced her sister in the direct and total way of someone for whom restraint in this particular moment was not a consideration. Anya received this embrace with somewhat less abandon, but held on longer than Cole expected, her face pressed briefly against her sister's shoulder, and he looked away at the station house to give them the moment. When he looked back, Marta was looking at him. She had Anya's same quality of assessment, the same careful reading of a situation. But where Anya's assessments were private, Marta's registered openly on her face, and what registered now was something between curiosity and approval, still being decided. "You are Cole," she said. "I am," he said. She looked at him for another second. Then she said to Anya, in a tone of theatrical relief, "He is handsome." "Marta," Anya said, "I told you I would want to know." She picked up her bag from the platform without embarrassment and extended her other hand to Cole. "I am very pleased to meet you. My sister has written, not very much, but what she wrote was good." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, like Anya's, but warmer in temperature. "She told me you have 17 questions," he said. Marta laughed, loud and genuine and unconcerned with who heard it, exactly as Anya had described. "I have more now," she said, "but they can wait." Anya met his eyes over her sister's shoulder with an expression that said, precisely, "I told you." He almost smiled. Marta filled a house differently than Anya did. Where Anya's presence was a steady, quiet warmth, the kind you noticed when it was gone, Marta's presence was immediate and audible. She talked through dinner, talked while she helped clear the table, talked while she examined the kitchen with the same inventory-taking look Anya had given it in November, asked questions about Black Hollow, and the railroad, and the Henderson-Prater land dispute, and Doc Hessler and Ruth, whom she apparently already had strong positive feelings about based solely on Anya's letters. Cole answered when he was asked, and mostly watched, because the thing happening at his kitchen table was not something he had vocabulary for. The two sisters talking, slipping between English and Czech, and back again without marking the transitions, finishing each other's sentences, arguing about something minor in a way that was completely without heat, just two people who had been doing this since childhood and knew exactly how it went. He had not thought, when Anya said she is the only family I have left, about what it would look like to have that family present in the house. He understood it differently now. Not abstractly, but in the specific and human terms of two women at a kitchen table, one of them using her hands when she talked, and the other watching her with an expression that was entirely unguarded. This was what Anya had been carrying all winter. Not just her sister's absence, but the absence of being known this completely, by someone who had known her since before either of them had to be competent at anything. After dinner, Marta went to bed early, claiming the honest exhaustion of 2 days of travel, and Cole and Anya sat in the main room in the quiet that her sister's departure left behind. The fire wasn't lit. It was July and warm enough without it, but Anya had lit the lamps and the room was soft and yellow. "She likes you," Anya said. "She doesn't know me yet." "Marta decides quickly," she said. "She is not always right, but she is not wrong often." She looked at the dark fireplace. "She cried when I left Chicago. I did not see it because I did not look back, but she told me in a letter. She said she cried the whole way home." Cole looked at her. "I did not look back," Anya repeated quietly. "I had decided to go, and I could not afford to. I needed to not look back." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about that. About all the things I did not look back at. The ship leaving Hamburg, the train leaving New York, the train leaving Chicago." A pause. "I was always leaving places. I was very good at it. And now?" She looked at him. "Now I am staying somewhere," she said. "I'm still learning what that feels like." He thought about what Doc Hessler had said months ago. Say it before it's too late. Some things don't wait forever. He thought about the version of himself who had been eating beans from a tin in October, who had placed a newspaper advertisement because Ruth had put it on his desk and stared at him until he did. He thought about the platform in November, dark and cold, and a woman coming down the train steps with a leather bag, scanning the platform until she found his badge. "It feels like coming home," he said, "even when you're already there." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand over his, briefly, and took it back. It was the first time she had done that without a practical reason, not helping him, not reaching past him for something, just her hand on his, for a moment, because she had wanted to. Small things. That was what it was made of. The circuit preacher arrived in Black Hollow on a Thursday, riding a horse that looked tired of the circuit and a man who looked tired of nothing, which was either a spiritual quality or a professional one. His name was Reverend Aldous, and he had been riding this territory for 11 years and had, according to Ruth, performed more weddings in barns and front parlors than he'd ever counted, which made him Cole's preferred variety of authority, one who had stopped requiring things to be other than what they were. They were married on a Saturday morning. Cole had been right that he didn't want anything large, and Anya had been right that she wanted something real, and what they got was both of those things. The parlor of the house, with the windows open to the July morning. Ruth, who cried in the contained way of someone who had been exercising self-control all her life, and was giving herself a small allowance for the occasion. Doc Hessler, who stood straight and solemn and shook Cole's hand afterward with both of his. Marta, who did not cry but held Anya's hand through the whole thing and afterward hugged her again in that complete and uncalculating way, and then turned to Cole and said, "Now you are my family too," with a matter-of-factness that made it not sentimental, and therefore more true than if it had been. Aldous read what needed to be read. Cole said what needed to be said, in a voice that came out steadier than he expected. Anya said her part looking at him directly, the way she did everything, with that composed and open expression that he had been reading for 8 months and still didn't have completely figured out, which he had come to understand was not a failing on his part, but a quality of her. That she had depths that didn't all show at once, that would take years to know, and that this was not a problem. Afterward, there was food that Marta and Anya had made the day before, and Ruth brought a cake that was very good and slightly lopsided, and they sat in the kitchen with the windows open and the July air coming through and the sound of the creek in the distance, lower now in late summer, almost quiet. Doc Hessler had a second piece of cake and said to Cole, while Marta was demonstrating something to Ruth and Anya with animated gestures, "You look different." "Different how?" Doc considered. "Like you've stopped doing the thing where you're waiting for the next problem." Cole looked across the kitchen at Anya, who was watching her sister with that unguarded expression, the one she had when she wasn't managing herself. "I still expect problems," he said. "Sure," Doc said, "but now you expect other things, too." He finished his cake. "That's the whole difference, the other things." Marta stayed for 2 weeks. She and Anya filled the house with Czech and English and laughter, and Cole moved around the edges of this the way he moved around most things, quietly, paying attention, saying less than he was thinking. But Marta was not a woman who let people stay at the edges indefinitely. She pulled him into conversations with the practiced ease of someone who had never found a person too quiet to engage, asked him about his work and his history and the mountains and the railroad and what he thought about the territory's future, and listened to his answers with the same focused attention Anya had. It was, he realized, a family trait. On her last evening, while Anya was finishing the dishes, Marta came and sat next to Cole on the porch in the summer dark and said, without preamble, "She was very alone before this. I want you to know that." Cole looked at the street. "Not unhappy always," Marta said, "but alone. She does not ask for things. She never has. She decides what she needs and she goes and gets it herself, and she does not let herself need more than she can get alone." A pause. "It is how she survived, but it is also how she was lonely for a long time without calling it that." "I know," Cole said. "Do you?" Marta looked at him. "Because I am not telling you to be careful with her. I am telling you the opposite. I am telling you not to let her be alone in the old way. She will do it if you let her. She will manage everything by herself and call it fine. You have to—" She stopped. "You have to insist on being there. She will not ask." Cole thought about November, about a woman who arrived with a worn bag and immediately started taking inventory of what needed to be done. About months of "I can handle it, and it was nothing, and I do not complain." "I know," he said again, more quietly. Marta looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back inside. He sat on the porch in the dark for a little while, thinking about what she'd said, and about the version of himself before November, and about the particular error both he and Anya had been making in their separate lives before that train came in late and changed the direction of things. Two people who had gotten very good at not needing anyone, which looked like strength from a distance and felt, from the inside, like a slow kind of starvation. The thing no one tells you about building walls against being hurt is that they don't actually keep out the hurt. They keep out everything else and leave the hurt alone inside with you. He had known this, in the abstract, for years. He had not known what to do with it until a woman stepped off a train with a leather bag and made coffee better than he'd ever made it, and told him plainly, in April, that she was glad to be there. He went inside. Anya was at the kitchen table, writing in the journal she'd started keeping sometime in the spring. Not letters, just her own account of things, in Czech, private. She looked up when he came in. "She talked to you," Anya said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What did she say?" He sat down across from her. "She said you don't ask for things." Anya looked at her journal. "She is not wrong. I know." He waited until she looked up. "I'm going to be there anyway, whether you ask or not. You should know that." She held his gaze. Something moved through her expression, the old wariness and the new trust, both present, both real. She was not, as Marta said, someone who would be fixed of the old habits quickly or completely. She would still try to manage things alone sometimes. She would still go quiet when she was struggling and call it fine. These were not things that one winter and one promise erased, but she looked at him now and said, "I know." And it landed differently than it would have in November, when it would have been a practical acknowledgement. Now it was something else. Now it was someone choosing, on purpose, to believe a thing. Marta left on the Wednesday stage with her bag and her loose hair and the particular energy she brought to departures, which was the opposite of grief. She treated goodbyes the way she treated most things, as temporary conditions rather than endings. She held Anya for a long time at the stage stop and said something in her ear that made Anya close her eyes briefly. Then she stepped back and looked at Cole. "Take care of my sister," she said. "Yes," he said. "And write to me," she said to Anya, "more than before, with details." "I will write the same amount as before," Anya said. "That is not enough." "It is what you will get." Marta laughed, climbed onto the stage, leaned out the window to wave once, and was gone. Anya stood and watched until the stage turned the corner and disappeared. Then she stood a moment longer, looking at the empty road. Cole stood beside her without speaking. "She will be all right in St. Louis," he said, after a moment. "Yes," Anya said. "She's very good at being all right." She turned away from the road. "Better than me, in some ways." "Different ways," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, different ways." They walked home. Autumn came for the second time, and with it the particular quality of Montana light in September, the angle of it changing again, the mornings carrying cold that would become serious cold soon. The aspens went gold on the slopes. The creek settled to its autumn level, clear and cold over the stones. The house at the north end of Black Hollow, which had stood mostly silent through the summer with its windows open and its rooms used differently than they had been in years, began to close itself against the coming cold the way it always had. Except now the closing was done by two people rather than one, and the result was different. Cole banked the woodpile in the first week of September, splitting wood in the evenings after his rounds while the light lasted. Anya came out sometimes and stacked what he split, without comment, the way they did things together. Not because either needed the other's help, but because the company was the point. "Last year you did this alone," she said one evening, straightening a row of split wood. "Yes." "The year before also." "And the year before that." She looked at the pile. "That is a lot of years of doing things alone." "It is," he said. She picked up another piece and set it in place. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The quiet, the—" She made a gesture that meant the whole of what he'd had before. He set the axe down and thought about it honestly, because she had asked honestly. "No," he said. "I missed it at the time, while I was in it, but that's different." "What do you mean?" "When you're living a life you've settled for," he said, "you can convince yourself you've chosen it. You tell yourself the quiet is peace. You tell yourself not needing anyone is strength." He looked at the woodpile. "It takes a while to understand the difference between peace and just absence." Anya was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," she said simply, like he'd said something she'd been thinking for a long time without that exact shape. The railroad broke ground in October, which brought the influx of workers Cole had been preparing for since May, and the particular variety of trouble that followed construction crews arrived on schedule. He managed it the way he managed everything, methodically, without drama, dealing with each thing as it presented itself. It was more work than the quiet winters had been. It was also, he noticed, less lonely. He came home from a long day in November, almost exactly a year since Anya had stepped off the train, and found the kitchen warm and lit and her at the stove, and he hung up his coat and pulled off his boots, and she turned to look at him with an expression that was reading the kind of day he'd had the way she always did, and she said, "Sit down. I'll get you coffee." He sat down. The coffee came. She sat across from him. "How bad?" she asked. "2 fistfights, one a broken window at the saloon, and one man who thought he could ride a horse he very clearly could not ride." He drank the coffee. "The horse is fine." She made the small sound that meant she was amused. "And the man?" "He'll be more careful next time." She nodded, satisfied. Then she said, "Ruth is going to start carrying Czech pickles, the kind I told her about. She found a supplier in Billings." "Is that good?" "It is excellent," she said, with a conviction that was entirely genuine, which Cole had come to understand was how she talked about food she cared about. "She asked me to write the order in Czech, so there was no confusion. I did it this afternoon." "How was the store?" "Busy. The railroad men are buying supplies." A pause. "Old Mr. Presley came in. He asked about you." "What did you tell him?" "That you were fine and managing well." She looked at her cup. He said to me, "You've been good for this town, Mrs. Mercer." He said it like it was a fact and not a compliment. She said it quietly, and there was something in her voice that was not quite steady. Cole looked at her across the table. Mrs. Mercer. She had been hearing it for 4 months, and still, sometimes, it did something to her expression that she didn't entirely control. "You have been," he said. She looked up. "I only did what I knew how to do. That's all any of us can do," he said. "The ones who do it well are the ones who know what they're doing." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on his. The same gesture from July, brief and deliberate. And this time she left it there. Outside, November was arriving the way it had arrived a year ago, with that particular cold clarity that comes before the first serious snow. The wind from the mountains was picking up, finding the north side of the house, which held. The house held. That was the thing Cole thought about sometimes, in the quiet moments between one thing and the next. Not the grand shape of how his life had changed, that was too large to hold all at once, but the small particular fact of it. A house that had stood at the edge of a frontier town, solid and well-built and completely empty, for 3 years. And then a woman had stepped off a train and walked into it, and the house had not changed in any visible way. Same walls, same floors, same drafty window in the east bedroom that still stuck when it rained. But something in it had been restored that he hadn't known was missing. The thing that makes a structure into a place where people live. He was not, even now, a man who expressed things easily. He was still too quiet, still too much inside his own head, still capable of going a whole day in his own thoughts without surfacing. Anya was still too self-contained, still carried her difficulties alone by instinct, still had moments of the old wariness when trust asked more of her than she was immediately ready to give. They argued sometimes, real arguments, not performances, about real things, and the arguments were uncomfortable and unresolved for hours, and resolved eventually in the matter-of-fact way of two people who have decided that the resolution is not optional. They were, in other words, imperfect people in a real marriage, which was the only kind of marriage there was. But the house was warm. The coffee was good in the mornings. There were letters from Marta with too many questions and not enough details about her own life, and Anya read them at the kitchen table and wrote back in the same careful check, and sometimes she read pieces of them aloud in translation, and Cole listened and built a picture of a woman he had only met once who was becoming, slowly, part of what he knew. There was the sound of another person in the house. There was someone to come home to. There was the particular quality of a life that has been chosen rather than settled for, which is different in the way that warmth is different from merely not being cold. The whispers in Black Hollow had faded the way whispers do when the thing they were speculating about becomes ordinary. Anya Mercer, the name settling around her the way a well-made garment settles, not changing what's underneath but fitting it, was behind the counter at Callaway's 3 days a week and was known, and the being known was the whole answer to the whispers. People are suspicious of abstractions. They are mostly decent to people they know. A year after she had stepped off a train into a dark and frozen platform with a leather bag and a lifetime of surviving things, Anya stood in the kitchen of the house at the north end of Black Hollow and looked out the window at the first snow of the new winter, coming down in the early evening in the slow, preliminary way of a snow that was testing its welcome. Cole came in from the barn, stamping his boots on the porch. "First snow," he said, coming in. "Yes." She was still looking out the window. "I saw." He came to stand beside her, not at a careful distance but close, the way they stood now when they were looking at the same thing. The snow was coming down on the street, on the rooftops, on the mountain slopes above the town, making the world quieter and slower and white. "You know," she said, "I thought when I came here, I thought this was a place I was passing through, on the way to somewhere else." She paused. "I had been passing through places for so long. It was all I knew how to do." "And now?" he said. She turned to look at him. Her face was entirely itself, composed and open and direct and not quite smiling, the expression he had been reading for a year and would spend the rest of his life learning. "Now," she said, "I am somewhere." Outside, the snow kept falling on Black Hollow. The house held the warmth of the stove and the lamps, and two people standing at a kitchen window, watching winter arrive for the second time. It was not a perfect life. It would not become one. But it was theirs, built from the particular materials they had, the hard years, the bad habits, The slow and imperfect learning of how to stop surviving and start living. Built the way good things are built, gradually, stubbornly, by people who had good reason to give up and didn't. The snow fell. The house held. That was enough. That was in every way that mattered more than enough.